The heart monitor flatlined at 11:47 a.m., and in the 3 seconds of absolute silence that followed, Dr. Adrian Mercer did the one thing no one expected. He pointed directly at the nurse standing beside him, not at the anesthesiologist, not at the surgical tech who had prepped the tray, at Megan Brooks, 29 years old, 5 years out of the Army, the quietest person in the room. "She contaminated the medication," Mercer said, his voice shaking just enough to sound convincing. "Get her out of my OR." Security arrived in 4 minutes. Megan was escorted out in 6, and 12 minutes after that, 3 armored military vehicles rolled through the hospital's front entrance without slowing down. If this story has your attention, follow along with me until the very end. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Megan Brooks had not planned on any of it going the way it did. She had shown up at Ironcrest Regional Hospital at 6:52 that morning with a thermos of coffee that had gone cold during the commute and a pair of compression socks she'd bought 2 weeks ago and still hadn't broken in properly. She worked the surgical floor on Tuesdays and Thursdays, pulled ER overflow shifts whenever staffing was thin, which was almost always, and she kept to herself in the way people do when they've learned that getting too comfortable in a place tends to end badly. She wasn't unfriendly. She remembered patients' names, their kids' names, which ones needed the lights dimmed and which ones needed someone to just keep talking. But she didn't go to the after-shift drinks. She didn't join the group chats. She ate lunch alone in the break room with a paperback she'd been slowly working through for 3 months, and nobody thought to ask why. The Army had been 6 years of her life. She'd enlisted at 21, spent her first 18 months in training, and then spent the next 4.5 years doing things she still couldn't fully describe to civilians without watching their eyes go somewhere uncomfortable. She'd been a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Battalion, attached, not organic, which was a distinction that mattered to exactly no one outside of military circles, but mattered enormously to her. She'd been in places where the margin between a patient living and dying was measured in seconds, and in whether she kept her hand steady when everything around her was loud and wrong and on fire. She'd been decorated twice. She'd come home with both her legs, most of her hearing, and a recurring nightmare about a firebase outside of a city she was still not supposed to name. She'd left on her own terms. Honorable discharge. She'd done her time, done it well, and then she'd walked away because she was 27 and she wanted to sleep in the same place for more than 3 months in a row. She'd gotten her RN license in 14 months, which was fast enough that her instructors had flagged it twice to make sure she wasn't cutting corners. She wasn't. She just already knew most of it. Ironcrest was her 3rd hospital in 2 years. Not because of performance issues, her evaluations were clean, but because hospital culture had a way of calcifying around her before she figured out how to fit inside it. She was too direct. She asked too many questions. She documented things other nurses let slide because documenting things created paperwork, and paperwork created friction, and friction created enemies. Megan created friction without meaning to, and she'd stopped apologizing for it somewhere around the 2nd year of her RN career when she'd documented a medication discrepancy at St. Aldrich Memorial that turned out to be a billing fraud scheme, and the hospital had quietly thanked her and then made her schedule so unworkable that she'd resigned within a month. She understood after that what kind of nurse she was going to be. At Ironcrest, she'd been working the surgical floor for 8 months. She knew the rhythms of the place, which orderlies actually cleaned between patients, which attending physicians were genuinely sharp, and which ones just projected confidence, which patients were being under-medicated because someone upstream had decided their pain wasn't worth the documentation. She knew that Operating Room 3 had a supply cart that got restocked inconsistently, that the second shift charge nurse had a habit of co-signing medication logs she hadn't actually reviewed, and that Dr. Adrian Mercer, the hospital's chief of surgery and its single biggest donor to the annual fundraising gala, treated the nursing staff the way certain men treat customer service representatives, like a necessary inconvenience between him and the outcome he wanted. She'd been assigned to his surgical team 5 times in 8 months. Each time he'd found something to criticize: her positioning, her timing, her silence when he expected confirmation, her response when he expected silence. The last time, 3 weeks before everything broke open, he had stopped mid-procedure to tell her in front of 4 other people that she moved like someone who learned nursing from a YouTube video. She had looked at him over her mask and said, "The drip rate on the secondary line is running high," and gone back to monitoring. He had corrected it without acknowledging her. The drip rate had been running high. She didn't like him, she didn't trust him, but she hadn't yet found anything she could put her name on. The morning of the surgery, the patient in OR3 was listed in the system as Gerald Whitmore, 54 years old, admitted 48 hours earlier for what had been charted as a scheduled cardiac procedure following a stress test. He was sedated, stable, already prepped when Megan arrived to relieve the night shift scrub nurse at 7:15. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Fiona Yates, one of the few people at Ironcrest Megan actively respected, gave her a brief handoff without any flags. Vitals steady. Pre-op meds administered on schedule. No contraindications noted. What Megan did notice, and what she filed at the back of her mind without yet knowing what to do with, was the medication tray. The vials were correctly labeled. The dosages were within normal range. Everything was arranged the way it should be, but there was a small inconsistency in the lot number on one of the secondary agents, a paralytic used to maintain surgical muscle relaxation. That didn't match the lot numbers on the other vials from the same restocking batch. She'd been in the supply room 2 days ago. She remembered the shipment. The numbers were off by enough to notice if you were the kind of person who noticed. She almost flagged it. She reached for the chart, pulled up the medication log, started to cross-reference. And then Dr. Mercer walked in. He was in a good mood, which was somehow worse than when he wasn't. He moved through the OR with the particular energy of a man who had never seriously doubted himself, giving short nods to the team, adjusting his gloves with a small performance of precision. He glanced at Megan the way he always did, half recognition, half mild annoyance, like encountering a piece of furniture he didn't remember ordering. "Brooks," he said, not looking at her, "verify the instrument count and initial the board." "I need 60 seconds first," she said. He looked at her then. "Excuse me?" "The lot number on the vicuronium secondary doesn't match the rest of the batch. I want to log it before we proceed." The room had that particular silence that surgical suites get when someone says something unexpected. Not loud, just a shift in attention, everyone angling slightly without moving. Mercer stared at her for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. "The medication has been reviewed by pharmacy." "I'm sure it has. I still want to log the discrepancy." "You want to log a lot number?" "Yes." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Initial the board, Brooks. We start in 4 minutes." She looked at him. She looked at the tray. She thought about the kind of fight this would be. Flagging a lot number discrepancy with no supporting evidence beyond her own memory of a supply room 2 days ago against a chief of surgery who had never been wrong about anything in his professional life, according to himself. She thought about her employment history. She thought about St. Aldrich Memorial. She initialed the board. She kept watching the tray. The surgery began at 8:09 a.m. and proceeded without incident for the first 2 hours. Mercer operated with the focused efficiency that explained, at least technically, why he had the reputation he had. The team moved in established rhythms. Megan monitored, documented, handed off instruments when called, tracked the secondary medication lines with the particular attention she gave to things that were bothering her. At 11:44, the patient's vitals began to shift. It was subtle at first. A slight irregularity in the rhythm, the kind of thing that could be an equipment artifact or a position issue. Yates adjusted, called it out, kept monitoring. Megan watched the secondary line, watched the rate, watched the color in the tubing. At 11:47, the monitor flatlined. The room snapped into emergency mode, Yates moving fast, calling orders, the surgical tech stepping back, Mercer pulling his hands from the field. Standard crisis response. Everyone had a role. Everyone moved, except Mercer. Mercer turned toward Megan. Later, she would try to understand the exact calculus of what happened in those 3 seconds. Whether he had already been looking for a way out, whether it was instinct or calculation or both, whether he'd known, even then, what was on that medication tray. "She contaminated the medication," he said, his voice controlled enough to carry across the room. "I want her out." "That's not..." Megan started. "Security. Now." She watched Yates's face, Yates was looking at the monitors, not at either of them. The surgical tech was frozen. The circulating nurse had already reached for the phone. Megan looked at the medication tray one more time, at the vial with the mismatched lot number. "I need someone to secure that tray," she said. Not loudly, evenly. "Don't let it leave the room." Nobody moved. Security arrived in 4 minutes. 2 of them, large, professionally neutral, doing their jobs. They didn't grab her. They didn't need to. They stood on either side of her and said, "Ma'am, we need you to step out." And she removed her gloves one finger at a time, dropped them in the biohazard bin, and walked out of OR3 with her back straight and her face giving nothing away. The hallway outside was already different. Word traveled fast in hospitals. 2 nurses from the medical floor were clustered near the elevator, not talking, watching her walk by. An orderly with a supply cart found somewhere else to be. The charge nurse for the surgical floor, a man named Aldous Gregg, who had been doing this job for 11 years and had the particular skill of never being in the wrong place at the wrong time, appeared in the corridor with a tablet in his hand and a carefully neutral expression. "Megan, administration wants to see you." "I know." "This is—" He paused. "This is serious. They're talking about immediate suspension. I heard the patient's vitals dropping before the flatline. I noted a medication discrepancy before the procedure. Both of those things are documented." She stopped walking. "Who is the patient, Aldous?" He glanced at the security guards. "I don't have that information." "Yes, you do. He was listed as Gerald Whitmore, but his admission paperwork has a federal privacy designation I've only seen once before, and that was when we had a visiting diplomat in post-op 2 years ago at Meridian General." Greg said nothing. "Who is he?" "Megan, I really think you should just—" From the lobby, 3 floors down and half a building away, there was a sound. She heard it before she understood it. A deep mechanical thrumming, rhythmic, getting louder. The specific frequency of rotor blades, more than one, moving fast and low. She stopped walking entirely. She knew that sound. She'd spent 6 years knowing that sound, what it meant, what came after it, how fast things changed when you heard it at that proximity and at that angle of approach. Her body recognized it before her brain finished processing it, the way it does when something is stored not just in memory, but in the nervous system itself. Military helicopters, at least 2, descending toward the hospital campus. The security guards exchanged a look. One of them reached for his radio, and then the hospital's overhead PA, which normally announced things like respiratory therapy to room 412 and code blue in the ICU, clicked on with a sharp burst of static, and a voice that did not belong to the hospital's regular dispatch said, with complete calm and absolute authority, "All staff, all visitors, this facility is now under a federal security hold. No one enters or exits the building. This is not a drill." The hallway went completely still. Down the corridor, through the window at the end of the surgical wing, Megan could see the parking lot. 3 vehicles, black, armored, moving in coordinated formation, pulled through the hospital's service entrance without stopping. Behind them, a 4th vehicle, larger, marked with designations she recognized from her time in uniform. She felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The specific sharpening of attention that came from knowing that the situation had just changed in ways that most of the people around her hadn't caught up to yet. One of the security guards said, "What the—" "Put the radio down," Megan said quietly. He looked at her. "They'll be jamming civilian frequencies. Anything you transmit right now goes nowhere useful." She looked at Greg. "Get everyone away from the windows, and somebody needs to go back to OR3 right now and make sure that medication tray has not been moved." "You've been suspended," Greg said, but his voice had lost its administrative certainty. "I'm aware." She turned and started back toward the surgical wing. Neither security guard stopped her. The lobby. She could hear it now, 3 floors down. The sounds of controlled disruption, boots on the hard floor of the entrance. The particular clipped commands of people who had trained for exactly this kind of entry. Not panicked, not aggressive, efficient. She knew the difference. She reached the doors of the surgical wing and pushed through them just as Aldous Gregg's radio, on the hospital's internal channel, which apparently was not being jammed, crackled with a voice she didn't recognize. "This is Commander Dale Rourke, United States Special Operations Command. I need the surgical floor. I need it now. And I need someone to tell me where Nurse Megan Brooks is." The doors swung shut behind her. In OR3, the emergency team was still working on the patient. The room had the dense, focused chaos of a resuscitation, people moving, equipment beeping and alarming, Yates calling numbers. Megan took in the scene in 2 seconds. The patient was still in crisis but hadn't coded again. Yates had stabilized the rhythm with pharmaceutical intervention, but her face said she didn't understand why the first intervention had failed. The medication tray was still there. Nobody had moved it. Small mercy. Mercer was standing at the far side of the room with his arms crossed, mask pulled down around his neck, watching the resuscitation with an expression that was trying to look like professional concern but kept sliding into something else. He saw Megan come through the door. "Security?" He raised his voice. "I said she was to be removed." "I'm not here to argue with you," Megan said. She walked directly to the medication tray, picked up the vial with the mismatched lot number, held it up to the surgical light, looked at it. "Put that down," Mercer said. He started toward her. "Don't," she said. Not loudly. The word landed like a door closing. He stopped. She turned the vial in the light. The solution was the correct color. The label was correct. The lot number was the only thing that didn't belong. She turned it over. On the bottom of the vial, nearly invisible against the dark glass, was a secondary marking. Not a standard pharmaceutical stamp, something applied after manufacturing, small and precise. She'd seen this before, not at a hospital. In a forward operating base during her third deployment, a field medic from a partnered intelligence unit had shown her a vial confiscated from an insurgent medical cache. A paralytic agent, reformulated to be undetectable by standard field testing, disguised in a standard issue container. She'd held it under a flashlight in a tent in a country she still wasn't supposed to name, and the medic had said, "If you ever see the secondary marking on the bottom, you don't treat it as what the label says." She set the vial down carefully, turned to Yates. "Fiona, he's not responding to the vecuronium reversal because that vial isn't vecuronium. The agent in the secondary line is a reformulated paralytic. It'll read as standard on a basic talk screen, but it needs a different reversal protocol." She said the name of the agent. "You'll need Sugamadex plus the secondary compound. It's in the controlled formulary under a different classification." Yates stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I've seen it before." "That's not—" Yates shook her head once, quick, a doctor's reflex toward skepticism. Then she looked at her patient, at the numbers that still weren't right, at the failed reversal, and made the calculation that good physicians make when the evidence stops matching the theory. "Get me Sugamadex," and someone look up the secondary compound she's describing. "Do not follow those orders," Mercer said from across the room. His voice had changed. It had gone very controlled, very precise, the specific tone of a man who is trying to stay ahead of something. "Brooks is not a physician. She's a suspended employee who has violated protocol by entering this room. Nothing she says—" "Adrian." Yates's voice was flat. "Be quiet." The room went quiet. Megan stepped back from the tray. She looked at Mercer. He looked back at her, and in his face she saw something shift. Not quite fear, not quite guilt, but a kind of recalculation, the expression of a man who had planned for several outcomes and was now trying to determine which one this was. The OR doors swung open. The man who came through them was wearing tactical gear with federal insignia, and he moved through the room the way people move when they've been trained to occupy space, not aggressively, but completely. Behind him, 2 more operators. Behind them, a 4th person in civilian clothes with a federal ID visible on a lanyard. The commander? Tall, somewhere in his late 40s, the particular stillness of someone who had made a great many high-pressure decisions and had stopped being surprised by any of them, scanned the room once. His eyes moved to Megan. They stopped. He crossed the room in 4 steps, stopped in front of her. And then, in the middle of OR3, with a flatline patient being resuscitated 3 feet away and a chief of surgery watching from across the room and a surgical team that hadn't moved in 30 seconds, Commander Dale Rourke raised his right hand and gave a sharp, precise military salute. "Sergeant Brooks," he said, "we've been looking for you for the last 20 minutes." The room was absolutely silent. Mercer took one step backward, and then he stopped, and his face went the color of old paper, and he did not say anything at all. Megan looked at the commander for a long moment. Then she looked back at the patient on the table, at Yates, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between disbelief and a very specific kind of relief. "I'll need access to the full medication log for this patient going back 48 hours, Megan said, "and someone needs to secure every exit from the pharmacy on this floor." "Already done," Rourke said. "The vial on the secondary tray has been tampered with. I believe there are others." "We know." She nodded once, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. Behind her, she heard Mercer's voice, quieter now, stripped of its usual authority, reaching for something it wasn't finding. I have rights here. I want legal counsel. I want to know what authority." "Dr. Mercer." Rourke didn't turn around. "Don't move from where you're standing." One of the operators positioned himself between Mercer and the door. Megan turned back to the patient, to Yates, to the work. "Walk me through what you've given him so far," she said. "Everything, in order." Yates started talking. Megan listened with the focused attention that had, once upon a time, been the difference between coming home and not. The kind of listening that processes information and acts on it at the same time, that doesn't need things to be calm or orderly or fair before it starts working. The patient's name was not Gerald Whitmore. She understood that now. She didn't yet know what it was, or why military special operations had materialized in an Ironcrest Regional Hospital or on a Tuesday morning. But she understood enough. She understood that the medication had been switched. She understood that she had noticed and had been removed before she could do anything about it. She understood that whoever had switched it had used credentials that existed within this hospital, on this floor, with access to this operating room. She understood, in the particular quiet way that facts arrange themselves when you've been trained to read situations rather than people's explanations of situations, that Mercer had not been surprised by the crash. He had been surprised by her coming back through the door. The patient's monitor showed the rhythm beginning to stabilize, slowly, unevenly, the way a cardiac rhythm does when it's fighting its way back from the edge of something serious. Not clean, not resolved, but moving in the right direction. Yates exhaled, sharp and controlled. "It's working." Megan kept her eyes on the line. "Give it another 4 minutes before you call it." Across the room, Mercer said nothing. The operator standing between him and the door hadn't moved. In the corridor outside, she could hear footsteps, multiple sets, coordinated, moving with purpose through the surgical wing. She thought about the lot number, about the secondary marking on the vial's base, about the moment that morning when she'd almost flagged it and hadn't, and what the cost of that almost was going to turn out to be. She thought about the way Mercer had said her name in the OR. She contaminated the medication, the precision of it, the speed, the fact that he'd already been looking in her direction. The monitor continued its slow, uneven climb back towards stability. She kept her hands steady and her face still, the way she'd learned in places where the cost of doing otherwise was something you didn't get to calculate after the fact. Outside, through the single small window at the top of the OR wall, the sky above Ironcrest was loud with the sound of rotors that hadn't yet gone silent. The rotors didn't go quiet for another 40 minutes. Megan heard them cycling down in stages, the way military aircraft do when they're settling into a position rather than leaving one. And she filed that information in the same place she'd been filing everything else since Rourke walked through the door. They weren't going anywhere. Whatever this was, it wasn't a quick extraction. It was a perimeter. The patient's rhythm had stabilized by the time the last of the rotor noise dropped to a low idle. Not perfect. The line on the monitor still had the jagged, cautious look of a system that had been pushed to its edge and wasn't ready to trust itself again. But stable enough that Yates stepped back from the head of the table and pulled off her gloves with the slow, deliberate movement of someone releasing a breath they'd been holding for 20 minutes. "He's going to need ICU monitoring," Yates said. Not to anyone in particular, to the room. "He's not going to the ICU," Rourke said from behind them. Yates turned. "He needs continuous cardiac monitoring, and he's going to a secure recovery suite on the 4th floor, We pre-staged it before we came in. Your ICU will be notified, but access will be restricted. Rourke's voice wasn't unkind, but it had the particular finality of someone who had already made this decision and was relaying it as a courtesy. We have our own medical personnel. Sergeant Brooks will provide a handoff brief. Megan looked at him. I'm not Sergeant anything anymore. Force of habit. My apologies. He didn't look sorry. He looked like a man running 7 things at once and allocating a small percentage of his attention to the conversation. Will you provide the brief? Yes. She spent 12 minutes walking Rourke's medical officer, a compact, precise woman named Lieutenant Darla Hewitt, who asked exactly the right questions and wrote nothing down because she was recording everything. Through the treatment she'd directed, the compound she'd identified, and the reversal protocol she'd used. Hewitt listened without interrupting. When Megan finished, Hewitt said, The identification of the secondary marker. Can you detail that? Third deployment captured material. I saw a similar compound in a field cache. You'd testify to that chain of recognition? If I have to. You will. Hewitt closed the recorder. Thank you. Across the room, Mercer had been standing in the same spot for 45 minutes. One of Rourke's operators, a younger man, broad-shouldered with the specific kind of stillness that meant he'd been stationed there on purpose, had positioned himself 6 feet away and hadn't moved. Mercer had tried twice to make calls on his cell phone. The first time, the operator had simply said, Please put the phone away, sir. The second time, he hadn't needed to say anything. Something about the way he'd shifted his weight had been sufficient. Mercer now stood with his arms crossed and his face arranged into an expression that was meant to read as composed indignation and was actually reading as something much closer to calculation. Megan had watched enough people under pressure to know the difference. He was thinking. Running scenarios. Trying to figure out the shape of what was happening to him and whether there was still a path through it. She finished the handoff brief and walked toward the OR doors. Rourke fell into step beside her. The tray, she said. Every vial needs individual testing, not batch testing. If one was switched, there may be others that were switched identically. Same label, same lot forgery, different compound. They'll pass a batch screen. Our forensics team is already on it. How long has he been a patient here? Rourke was quiet for 3 steps. 48 hours? And the admission was arranged through the hospital's standard intake process? Externally, yes. The federal designation was embedded in the file but not flagged at the administrative level. He paused. Which is how it was supposed to work. Nobody outside of the security detail was supposed to know who he was. Somebody knew? Yes. She pushed through the OR doors into the corridor. The hallway had been transformed in the time she'd spent inside. 2 of Rourke's operators stood at the elevator bank. Another was positioned at the stairwell door. The nurses and orderlies who normally populated this corridor were clustered at the far end near the break room, some of them sitting, most of them standing, all of them doing the specific kind of quiet that people do when they're frightened and trying not to show it. Aldous Gregg was among them. He saw her come through the doors, and his face did something complicated. Relief and guilt and professional discomfort, all arriving at the same time, and none of them winning. She walked past him without stopping. She had things she needed to do, and approximately none of them involved making Aldous Gregg feel better about the last 2 hours. The medication storage room for the surgical floor was at the end of the corridor, past the scrub sinks, behind a door that required a key card and a 4-digit code that changed weekly. Rourke's forensics specialist, a civilian contractor, older, wearing a vest with more pockets than Megan had seen on anyone outside of a field kit, was already inside when she arrived. He had the controlled medication cabinet open and was documenting each vial with a handheld scanner, moving with the systematic patience of someone who had done this specific thing many times before. You the nurse who made the ID? He said without looking up. Yes? Smart catch. He turned a vial in the light. We found 2 more with the secondary marker. Different medications, same substitution method. He finally looked at her. He had the face of a man who had been doing unpleasant work for a long time and had made a reasonable peace with it. This wasn't improvised. Somebody spent time on this. How much time? The forgery on the lot numbers is good. Not perfect. You caught it. But good enough that it would pass standard pharmacy review. We're thinking the switch happened in this room, not at the distribution point. Whoever did it had access to this cabinet. Megan looked at the cabinet, at the keycard reader, at the ceiling, where a small camera angled down toward the room's entrance. That camera active? Was. Footage from the last 72 hours was overwritten at 3 a.m. this morning. He paused. Which is interesting, because the system is set to a 14-day retention cycle. Someone overrode it manually. Someone with admin access to the security system? Yes. She stood there for a moment, thinking about the shape of what that meant. Not a breach from outside, not a random opportunist. Someone inside the hospital with layered access to the medication cabinet, to the security system, to enough operational knowledge of the patient's situation to know when to act and what to substitute. The kind of access that accumulated over time. That required a position of trust. She thought about Mercer's credentials, about the fact that as chief of surgery, his access extended across nearly every system in this building. She didn't say it out loud. Not yet. She didn't have the footage. She didn't have the keycard logs. What she had was a pattern she'd seen before in environments where people with authority used that authority as camouflage, and she'd learned expensively at St. Aldrich Memorial, where she'd named a theory before she had the documentation to back it, that patterns weren't enough. She needed the logs. She went back to the corridor and found Rourke talking in low, rapid tones to the civilian in the lanyard, a federal investigator named Soren, who had been introduced by last name only and had the neutral, watchful quality of someone whose job was to listen more than speak. She waited for a break in the conversation, and when it came, she said, "I need the electronic access logs for the medication storage room, every keycard entry in the last 72 hours, and the system logs for any manual overrides to the security camera or network." Rourke looked at Soren. Soren said, "We can pull those. You'll want to do it now before anyone on the administrative side realizes what you're looking for and decides to do some housekeeping." Soren's expression shifted by about 2 millimeters, not quite a smile. "Already in progress." She nodded and started to turn. Rourke said, "Brooks." She stopped. "You should know. The hospital's legal team arrived about 15 minutes ago. They're on the second floor with the CEO. From what we're hearing, the preliminary position is that you acted outside your scope, contaminated a controlled area after being formally suspended, and they're preserving the right to pursue action." She absorbed this. "Against me. Against you." She thought about the 2 security guards who'd walked her out of the OR, about Greg and the tablet and the word suspension delivered with administrative regret, about Dr. Mercer across the room, composing his face into indignation while a federal operator watched him from 6 feet away. "How long before your investigators have the access logs?" she said. "Hour, maybe 2. "Then I'll wait." She found an empty chair outside the scrub room and sat in it, and she pulled out her phone, and she pulled up her own documentation, the photos she'd taken of the medication tray before the surgery began, time-stamped and stored on her personal cloud backup, because she had learned at St. Aldrich Memorial that institutional documentation disappeared when it became inconvenient and personal documentation did not. She had photographed the tray at 7:22 a.m. The lot number discrepancy was visible in the third image if you knew what you were looking at. She zoomed in, sharpened, sent copies to her personal email, to a secure cloud folder, and to a number she hadn't dialed in 2 years. Her former JAG contact from her time at the battalion, a lawyer who had since gone into private practice and who had, on 2 separate occasions, told her to call if she ever needed someone who understood both the military and civilian medical systems. She typed, "Need to talk. Hospital situation, getting complicated. Call when you can." Then she sat back and watched the corridor. The surgical floor had the particular suspended quality of a place that knew something was wrong but hadn't been told what exactly to do with that knowledge. Nurses and techs moved past in small groups, talking quietly, glancing toward the OR doors and then glancing away. A hospitalist physician Megan vaguely recognized, young, hair still damp from what had probably been a very early morning, stopped at the nursing station, looked at the 2 operators at the elevator, and then slowly retreated back the way he'd come. At some point, Greg appeared beside her chair. He didn't sit. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at the floor for a moment before looking at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't think you did it." She looked at him. "Which part?" "Any of it." "But you were going to put the suspension paperwork through." He was quiet. "I have a job to do." "So do I." She looked back at the corridor. "Or I did." He left without saying anything else. She didn't watch him go. 40 minutes later, Soren appeared in the corridor with a tablet and an expression that had moved past neutral into something more precise. He stopped in front of her chair. "The access logs for the medication storage room," he said. "In the 72 hours prior to this morning's surgery, that room was accessed 11 times. 7 of those entries are accounted for by pharmacy staff with documented shift records." He turned the tablet so she could see the screen. "The other 4 entries were made using a single key card, all 4 between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. over the past 2 nights. She looked at the screen, at the keycard ID number. "That's a physician credential," she said. "Yes." "Whose?" Soren looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Dr. Adrian Mercer." She didn't say anything. She'd been waiting for confirmation, and confirmation had come, and there was a particular feeling that came with that. Not satisfaction, not vindication, something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a thing you suspected being true turning out to actually be true, and the weight of what that meant spreading out from that single point in all directions. "The camera override," she said. "Same credentials?" "Security system admin access was used at 2:47 a.m. this morning to manually purge the prior 72 hours of footage from the surgical floor cameras. The admin access was granted to Dr. Mercer 18 months ago as part of his chief of surgery role." She stood up. Her back was stiff from the chair. She pressed her thumb against her palm, a habit, something she did when she was processing, and she looked down the corridor toward the OR doors, behind which she knew Mercer was still standing with his arms crossed and his face performing composure. "He knew who the patient was," she said. "It appears that way. And he knew we'd be in that OR today. He arranged to be on the surgical team. We're still building that piece, but the substitution required advanced preparation. It wasn't reactive." Soren paused. "The question we haven't answered yet is who gave him the information about the patient's identity and the timing of the procedure." She thought about that, about the federal privacy designation embedded in the file, about the fact that someone outside the security detail had known enough to plan this precisely, to have the substituted compounds prepared in advance, to arrange a surgical team assignment and a credentialed access entry in the early hours of the morning. "There's someone else," she said. "Almost certainly." She looked at him. "Then you haven't secured everything yet?" "No," Soren said quietly. "We haven't." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. The JAG contact, now in private practice, billing at rates she definitely couldn't afford, had texted back. "Saw the news alerts about Ironcrest. Are you inside the building?" She typed, "Yes." The reply came in under 10 seconds. "Don't say anything to anyone without me present. I'm 30 minutes out." She pocketed the phone, looked at Soren. Who else had access to information about the patient's identity? Within this hospital? Within this hospital, or connected to it? Soren looked at her for a long moment. He was deciding how much to share, she could tell, doing the mental calculation that investigators did between maintaining operational security and leveraging an asset who had already proved useful. He came down on one side of it. "There's a name in the patient intake records," he said, "a secondary authorization, someone outside the standard admissions process who co-signed the federal privacy designation on the file. It's someone with hospital board-level access." He stopped. "We're looking at that person right now. Do you have them in the building?" "That's what we're trying to determine." His expression had shifted again, a new tightness around the eyes that hadn't been there 60 seconds ago. He glanced toward the elevator bank, where one of the operators had just touched his earpiece and straightened. The operator looked at Rourke across the corridor, said something low, into the comms. Rourke's face changed. He turned and moved toward them fast, and the way he moved told Megan everything before he said a word. "We have a problem," Rourke said. "The secondary authorization on the file, the board-level signatory." He paused for exactly 1 second. She left the building 22 minutes ago, before we secured the south exit. Megan stared at him. You had a security hold. The south exit has a loading dock. She used a catering vendor access code. His jaw was tight. She's in a vehicle. We have eyes on her, but she knows we're following. She just ran a red light on the service road heading toward the industrial district. The corridor was moving now. Operators repositioning, radios active. The quiet, controlled energy of people shifting from a hold position to a pursuit posture. Megan stood in the middle of it and felt the shape of the situation change around her the way it used to change when a mission's parameters shifted mid-execution. She thought about the access logs, the 2 a.m. entries, Mercer's keycard, and the secondary authorization, a board-level signatory, someone who had co-signed a federal privacy file, who had known enough and had enough access to be the link between whoever wanted this patient dead and the surgeon with the access codes and the pre-staged compounds. Someone who had walked out of the building 22 minutes ago. Someone who still had a phone and a vehicle and 22 minutes of head start. Who is she? Megan said. Rourke looked at her. Her name is Vivian Holt. She's been on the Ironcrest board for 9 years. He paused. She's also the person who hired you. The corridor noise kept going around her, but Megan stopped hearing it. 8 months ago, during her second interview for the Ironcrest position, there had been a woman at the table she hadn't recognized. Not medical staff, not HR. Someone who sat back from the conversation and watched more than she spoke. She'd introduced herself briefly, said she liked to meet new hires personally, said the hospital was a community, and community started with people. Vivian Holt. Megan had shaken her hand and thought, at the time, that the attention was flattering but slightly strange. Board members didn't typically sit in on nursing interviews. She understood now why this one had. Megan stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, which was about 2 seconds longer than she normally allowed herself to stand still when something had just shifted under her feet. Vivian Holt had sat across from her in a second-floor conference room 8 months ago, with reading glasses pushed up into her silver hair and a cup of tea she hadn't touched. And she had said, "We value nurses who notice things." She'd said it like a compliment. Megan had taken it as one. She moved past that memory the way you move past things that are going to require processing later. Filed, shelved. Not now. "What's her direction?" she said. "South on Caldwell Road, then east on the industrial corridor. We have 2 vehicles on her." Rourke was already moving toward the elevator bank, flagging his lead operator. "She's not going to the airport. There's nothing in that direction except warehousing and the old freight terminal. She has somewhere to go. Or someone to meet." He stopped at the elevator, looked at her. "I need you to stay on this floor." "I know. The investigation here isn't finished." "I know that too." He held her gaze for a moment, but not suspicious, just measuring. And then he stepped into the elevator with 2 of his operators, and the doors closed, and she was standing in the corridor again. Alone, with Soren 6 feet to her left, and the forensics contractor still audibly working in the medication room and the sound of the building around her doing the thing buildings did when something had gone wrong in them and hadn't finished yet. She went back to her chair, thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew Mercer had made the physical substitution. The access logs put him in the medication room in the early hours twice. She knew the compounds had been pre-staged, which meant preparation, which meant lead time, which meant someone had given him the patient's schedule with enough advance notice to source the materials. She knew Vivian Holt had co-signed the federal privacy designation on the patient's file, which meant she'd had visibility into who the patient was and when he'd arrive. What she didn't know was the mechanism, how Holt had accessed the federal designation file in the first place, what the patient actually was, not Gerald Whitmore, not a routine cardiac case, someone under special operations security. What connected Holt and Mercer beyond the institutional relationship of a board member and a chief of surgery? 9 years on the board, Rourke had said. Mercer had been chief of surgery for 7. They'd overlapped for 7 years in a mid-sized regional hospital where the board and the medical staff leadership worked in close enough proximity that the distance between them was more political than structural. 7 years was long enough to build a great many things. Soren had moved to the nursing station and was working quietly on a laptop, and after about 10 minutes he said, without looking up, "You're thinking about the network." She looked at him. What? You have the same expression my best analyst gets when she's trying to map a network without enough nodes. He kept typing. The question isn't just who, it's the infrastructure. Who connected them? What the mechanism was for sharing the federal file information? Whether there are others. Are there others? We don't know yet. The patient isn't the first person to have been admitted here under a federal privacy designation in the last 2 years. He's the first one we can confirm was targeted. The others... He paused, choosing his words. The outcomes of the others are being reviewed. She sat with that for a moment. Let it settle into its proper shape. You think this has happened before? We think it may have happened before and looked like something else. Medical error, she said, or natural deterioration, or complications from an existing condition. The kind of outcomes that are tragic and documentable and very difficult to prove weren't what they appeared to be. He finally looked up from the laptop. Which is why we needed this one. The patient today, he had monitoring that the others didn't. Off-site, continuous, running since admission. When his vitals started showing the pattern, we mobilized. The pattern from the compound. Yes, the compound has a signature in continuous cardiac monitoring that's subtle but specific. Our medical team identified it at 11:31. We were already rolling when the OR called the flatline. She thought about the 16 minutes between 11:31 and 11:47, about what had been happening in OR3 during those 16 minutes, about the vial with the secondary marker sitting on the tray while she'd been arguing with Mercer about logging a lot number discrepancy. If the vitals showed the pattern at 11:31, she said slowly, and the compound was already in his system by then. It had been introduced into the secondary line before the procedure began, Soren said. Most likely during the pre-op window when the surgical team was still assembling. I wasn't in the room during pre-op. I came in for the relief handoff at 7:15. The night shift scrub nurse who you relieved. We're talking to her now. He closed the laptop partway. She has no priors, no flags. 8 years at Ironcrest, clean record. But she was alone in that room with the tray from approximately 5 a.m. to 7:10 a.m. And she's currently giving inconsistent answers about a gap in her documentation between 6:20 and 6:45. Megan looked at him. How inconsistent. She says she stepped out to use the restroom. The restroom on this floor that scrub staff typically use shows no keycard entry during that window. She could have used a different restroom. She could have. He said it in a way that didn't endorse the possibility. Megan stood up again. She didn't have anywhere specific to go, but she'd been sitting too long and her body had strong opinions about sustained inaction when there was still information she didn't have. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor, the one she'd looked through earlier, when the parking lot was filling with armored vehicles. The lot was quieter now, but one of Rourke's units was still visible near the service entrance, and beyond the hospital's perimeter, she could see 2 police vehicles that hadn't been there before. Local law had arrived and been told to hold position. They were holding it, with the particular frustrated posture of agencies that were accustomed to being the authority in a situation and currently were not. Her phone buzzed. The JAG contact, Marcus Vell, she'd never stopped thinking of him by his last name, had upgraded from texts to a call. She answered. I'm in the parking lot, he said. The local police won't let me through. Tell them you represent Megan Brooks and you're requesting access through SOCOM liaison. Ask for Commander Rourke specifically. A pause. SOCOM. Yes. Another pause, longer. Megan, what did you walk into? I'm not completely sure yet. Come in through the main entrance, not the south side. And Marcus, I need someone to request the hospital's board meeting minutes from the last 2 years, specifically anything regarding the federal patient intake program. That'll require a subpoena. Then get one started. She watched a second police vehicle pull into the lot. Also, the hospital's legal team is in the building, 2nd floor. They're going to try to serve me with suspension documentation before the end of the day. Don't accept anything. I know. I mean it. Don't sign, don't acknowledge, don't... Marcus, I know. She hung up and went back to the corridor. The next 40 minutes were the kind that moved in 2 speeds simultaneously, fast in the operational sense, because Soren was pulling records and Rourke's forensics contractor was working through the medication cabinet with methodical speed, and somewhere in the industrial district south of the hospital, two vehicles were tracking a silver sedan carrying a hospital board member who had tried to walk out of a federal security hold, and slow in the experiential sense because Megan was doing what she had done in a great many waiting situations, which was manage herself carefully. She ate half a granola bar she found in her jacket pocket. She drank water from the break room, which was still occupied by the cluster of off-duty nurses and techs who had been corralled there 2 hours ago and were now going through the particular stages of a prolonged group containment. First anxious quiet, then murmured conversation, then someone making coffee, then a peculiar, almost normalcy that was entirely dependent on not thinking too hard about what was happening just down the hall. One of the nurses, a woman named Petra, who worked nights on the surgical floor and whom Megan knew well enough to nod at in the corridor, caught her eye when she came in for the water. "Did you actually figure out what was wrong with the patient?" Petra said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. "I identified the compound, yes. And Mercer?" She stopped, started again. "Is he being arrested?" "I don't know yet." Petra looked at her coffee cup. "He told us, about 6 months ago, that you were difficult, that you created unnecessary friction." She paused. "I told the nurse manager I thought you were the most careful nurse on the floor." Megan looked at her. "Did you?" "She told me I was letting personal preference cloud my professional assessment." Petra shrugged, but it wasn't a dismissive shrug. It was the shrug of a person who had said the right thing and been ignored and was still sitting with the specific residual discomfort of that. "I wrote it in my own notes, date and everything. I don't know if that matters." "It might," Megan said. "Don't delete it." She took her water and left. Back in the corridor, Soren met her at the nursing station with the laptop open and an expression that had sharpened since the last time she'd looked at him. "Board meeting minutes," he said. "We didn't need a subpoena. They're required to be filed with the state health department as part of the hospital's nonprofit status. The last 2 years of minutes were in the public record." "You found something." 14 months ago, the board approved a private patient intake program in partnership with a pharmaceutical research consultancy called Hargrove Meridian Group. The language in the minutes is vague: expanding specialized care capacity, research integration partnership. But the program authorized a specific intake pathway for quote-unquote high-security patients. She looked at the screen, at the language. That's the federal privacy designation pathway. It runs parallel to the standard federal protocol, but it's not actually federal. It was designed to look like one. Same forms, same classification markers. But the authorization chain doesn't go to any government agency. It goes to Hargrove Meridian. She straightened. So the designation on the patient's file is a forgery, a convincing one, which is how it passed the initial security review when he was admitted. Soren's voice was flat and precise. Someone inside Hargrove Meridian has been identifying protected federal assets, forging their intake designations to route them through this hospital, and then using the program as cover to access them. She said it slowly, letting the full shape of it arrive. The federal security detail travels with the patient because the designation looks legitimate. The patient goes into a hospital that appears to have federal authorization to receive them. And once they're inside, they're in a controlled environment. Operating room scheduled, surgical team assigned, compounds pre-staged. He closed the laptop. It's not opportunistic. It's a pipeline. She thought about what Rourke had said about the other patients, the ones whose outcomes were being reviewed, outcomes that had looked like medical error or natural deterioration. She thought about a pipeline that had been running for 14 months, that had moved through this hospital, that had used this medication storage room and these operating rooms and these access codes, and had done it quietly enough that the only person who had noticed anything was a nurse who happened to have seen a secondary marker on a vial in a different country under completely different circumstances. "How many patients?" she said. Soren was quiet for a moment. "We've identified 6 admissions through the forged pathway in 14 months. Today's patient is the 7th. And the others?" He looked at her. He didn't say anything, but his silence was specific enough. She looked at the floor, at the linoleum, scuffed from years of equipment wheels and shoe soles. She thought about 6 people, about what pipeline meant, about the fact that this had been running for 14 months in a building where she had been working for 8 of them, and she had not known, and the question of whether she should have known was one she was going to have to sit with for a long time. Hargrove Meridian, she said. Vivian Holt. Is she connected to them? She sits on their advisory board. He said it without inflection. Has for 11 years. The radio on the nursing station crackled. One of Rourke's operators, stationed at the elevator bank, pressed his earpiece and then straightened and said, "Commander's coming up." And 30 seconds later, the elevator opened and Rourke walked out, and his face told her the pursuit had not gone the way he'd wanted. "She ditched the vehicle," he said. "Freight terminal, south lot. Vehicle was empty when our people reached it. She had a 17-minute window before they got there." "Surveillance at the terminal?" "Offline. Has been for 6 weeks. Say, maintenance backlog." He said it with the controlled frustration of a man who did not throw things, but occasionally had to make a specific effort not to. "We have the plate and her description going to every transit hub within a 100-mile radius. Ports, private airstrips, rail." "She's not going to a commercial airport," Megan said. "No." Hargrove Meridian. Do they have a private aviation arrangement? Rourke looked at Soren. Soren was already opening the laptop. "Checking." While he typed, Megan looked at the elevator and thought about Vivian Holt. About a woman who sat on a hospital board for 9 years and an advisory board for 11, and had attended a nursing interview 8 months ago for reasons that were now making a different kind of sense. You hired someone the way you hired them when you needed to see them up close, when you needed to know what they noticed and how fast. She had shaken Vivian Holt's hand and said she valued thoroughness in documentation, and Holt had smiled and said, "So do we." Soren looked up from the laptop. Hargrove Meridian maintains a charter arrangement with a private aviation company based out of Kellner Regional Airfield, 32 miles southeast. 32 miles. Depending on traffic on the industrial corridor, a silver sedan with a 17-minute head start could cover that in. "She's already there," Megan said. Rourke was already on his comms. She turned back toward the OR wing. There was still work here. Mercer was still in OR 3, or wherever they'd moved him, and the forensics team was still working the medication room, and Soren still had a laptop full of records that needed to be converted into something a federal prosecutor could use. And none of that stopped being important because Vivian Holt had walked out through a loading dock. She was halfway down the corridor when the nursing station's desk phone rang. The operator at the elevator looked at it. It rang again. He reached for it, then stopped and looked at Soren. Soren said, "Put it on speaker." The operator hit the speaker button. The line was quiet for a moment. The particular quality of quiet that meant someone was there but choosing not to speak first. Then a woman's voice, measured and unhurried, the voice of someone who had made a decision about how this conversation was going to go and was committed to it. "I'd like to speak with the nurse." Soren looked at Megan across the corridor. Megan walked to the nursing station. She stood in front of the phone. "I'm here." "I know who you are," Vivian Holt said. "I've known for some time." A pause. "I also know what you found, and I know what you think you understand about it. I'd like you to know that you're missing approximately half the picture." Megan looked at Soren. He was already on his cell phone, one hand raised. Tracing the call, she understood. "Keep her talking." "Tell me the half I'm missing," Megan said. "The patients in that program weren't innocent people," Holt said. Her voice had no particular affect, not defensive, not guilty, simply informational, the tone of someone explaining a position they'd held for a long time. They were individuals under federal protection who had made arrangements that cost other people their lives, people who were going to disappear into protected status and never face any consequence for what they'd done. "So you decided to be the consequence?" "Someone had to." A brief pause. "I understand how that sounds. It sounds like 7 people." "6, Holt said. "The 7th is alive because of you." The corridor was completely still. Soren's hand was still raised. Megan kept her eyes on the phone. "Where are you?" she said. A small sound that might have been a breath. "I think you know that's not a question I'm going to answer." "Then why are you calling?" "Because I want you to understand something before this ends." Another pause. And in this one, Megan heard something she hadn't heard in the previous ones. Not remorse, exactly, but the particular weight of a person who had done what they intended to do and was now at the far edge of the calculation. Dr. Mercer will tell them he was coerced. He'll say I brought him in without his full understanding that he acted under duress. He's going to try to use me as an exit. Is he wrong? He's entirely wrong. He's been compensated for 7 years. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it for money, and because he enjoyed having a secret that made him feel like the most powerful person in any room. Her voice had changed. Not much, but enough. Don't let him use me as an exit. Whatever else happens, don't let him do that. Soren dropped his hand. He shook his head once. Not enough time. The call was coming from a mobile, moving. Vivian, Megan said. A pause. Nobody had used her first name in this entire conversation. She seemed to register it. Turn around, Megan said. Whatever you think you've accomplished. It doesn't hold if you run. The whole thing falls apart without your testimony. The line was quiet for long enough that Megan thought she'd lost her. Then Holt said, Mercer has a secondary drive. Not in the hospital. He keeps it off-site. A storage unit on Ferris Industrial Boulevard, Unit 114. Everything he documented to protect himself is on it. Names, dates, transfers. Another pause. I imagine that's more useful to you than anything I could say in a courtroom. The line went dead. Megan stood at the nursing station with the dead phone in front of her and the corridor around her very still, and she said to Soren, Ferris Industrial Boulevard, Unit 114. I heard it. How fast can you get someone there? Faster than she can. He was already on his phone. But, Megan, if she had that information and she's giving it to us now, she's not turning around. Megan said it without heat. She knew we were tracing the call. She knew it wouldn't give us enough time. She gave us the drive instead. She looked at the phone for one more moment. She made her trade. Soren stepped away to make his call. Megan stood where she was. Down the corridor, the OR doors opened and Rourke came through them, and behind him, flanked by 2 operators, was Dr. Adrian Mercer. He'd been moved from OR 3 to the surgical prep area, and now they were moving him again, toward the elevator, toward whatever came next in a process that was going to be very long and very thorough and very much not what he'd planned for when he'd walked into that operating room this morning in a good mood. He saw Megan. He stopped walking. Not because the operators stopped, they didn't, but because his body did something involuntary, a small recoil, the physical expression of a man confronting something he'd miscalculated. He looked at her across the length of the corridor, and she looked back at him, and in his face she saw it all. The scramble, the reconfiguration, the story he was already assembling about coercion and incomplete understanding, and a powerful woman who had brought him in without his full knowledge. She thought about what Holt had said. Don't let him do that. She looked at Rourke. There's a storage unit on Ferris Industrial Boulevard, Unit 114. Mercer kept a secondary drive with full documentation. Names, dates, payment transfers. It's not hospital property. He set it up to protect himself. Mercer's face went very still. Rourke looked at him, then back at Megan. Source: Vivian Holt. Direct call 2 minutes ago from a moving mobile. She gave it voluntarily. Rourke's expression didn't change much, but something in it recalibrated. He turned to his lead operator and said something low, and the operator nodded and moved toward the stairwell. Mercer said, That doesn't exist. His voice was steady, practiced. Whatever she told you, she's trying to... Dr. Mercer, Rourke said, and something in the way he said it closed the conversation the way a door closes. Not loud, just final. We'll see. The operators moved him forward. He went because there was nothing else to do. But his eyes stayed on Megan until the elevator doors closed between them. She stood in the emptied corridor and listened to the building around her. The forensics contractor still working, the murmur of voices from the break room, the distant mechanical idle of the helicopters that still hadn't fully stood down. The day had been running for, she checked her watch, just under 6 hours. It felt like it had happened in a different order than time usually worked. Her phone rang. Not Marcus Vell. An unknown number, but a prefix she recognized from her time in uniform. A SOCOM administrative exchange. She answered. A voice she didn't know said, "Nurse Brooks, this is Colonel Petra Nast, Judge Advocate General's office, SOCOM. We need to talk about your testimony, today, if possible." "I'm available," she said. "Good." A brief pause. "We also need to talk about something else. The secondary drive from the storage unit. Our people are 30 minutes out, but Dr. Mercer's legal counsel contacted our office 11 minutes ago." That was fast. It was. "And the council has filed an emergency motion claiming the storage unit was accessed illegally in a prior investigation, and any evidence found there is inadmissible." Another pause. "It's probably not going to hold, but it's going to create a window, and during that window, there are things that could go wrong." Megan thought about the drive, about 14 months of names and dates and transfers sitting in a storage unit on Ferris Industrial Boulevard, and a legal motion filed 11 minutes after the call from Vivian Holt that had identified it. "Mercer filed that motion," she said. 11 minutes after I told Rourke about the drive." "Yes." "He had counsel on standby." "He had counsel on standby." The colonel's voice was even. "Which means he's been expecting this for some time." She thought about that. About a man who had walked into the OR this morning in a good mood, who had blamed her in 3 seconds, who had been calculating the shape of this for long enough to have a legal strategy preloaded and ready to deploy. "Colonel," she said, "if the motion creates a window, how long a window? Depending on the judge, anywhere from 2 hours to 24. And during that window, who has access to the storage facility?" A pause that was 1 beat too long. "Colonel," Megan said again carefully, "who else knows about Unit 114? The line was silent for 3 full seconds, and then Colonel Nast said, in a voice that had dropped its administrative evenness and picked up something more direct, "We're not entirely sure." And down the hall, behind her, the forensics contractor called out from the medication storage room in a voice that had gone very flat and very controlled. "Soren, you need to come look at this." Megan told the colonel to hold and walked fast toward the medication room. The forensics contractor, his name was Deeks, she'd learned that somewhere in the last 4 hours, was standing in front of the controlled medication cabinet with a sealed evidence bag in one hand and his scanner in the other, and he was looking at the back wall of the cabinet with the specific stillness of someone who had just found something that changed the geometry of what they thought they were looking at. Soren was already in the doorway. "What is it?" Megan said. Deeks turned. "Back panel of the cabinet. It's a false wall, shallow, maybe 4 inches. Someone retrofitted it." He held up the evidence bag. Inside it was a small device, rectangular, roughly the size of a deck of cards, with 2 ports and a short cable coiled around it. Wireless transmitter. Passive. It doesn't broadcast continuously. It stores and transmits in short bursts on a delay cycle. Whoever installed it could pull data from this room without ever physically returning. Soren stepped forward. "Data from what?" "The cabinet's internal logging system. Every keycard entry, every item scanned, every dispensation record, all of it was being mirrored to an external receiver." Deeks set the bag down carefully on the counter. "This thing has been in here for a while. The dust accumulation on the mounting hardware puts installation at 8 to 14 months ago." 14 months, Megan thought. The board approved the Hargrove Meridian program 14 months ago. They weren't just using the access logs, she said. They were monitoring the medication cabinet in real time. They knew every drug movement, every stock update. They'd know the moment a shipment came in and which vials were in which position. Which is how they substituted without triggering a quantity discrepancy, Soren said. They knew exactly what was there and replaced it with an identical volume. "The transmitter receiver," Megan said to Deeks. "Can you trace where it was sending?" "Already running it. The burst frequency is short range, a few hundred meters. The receiver would need to be close." He paused. "Close like inside the hospital or in a vehicle in the parking lot with line of sight to this wing." Megan turned and looked at the window in the medication room. Small, frosted glass, facing the east side of the building. She thought about the parking lot, about the hospital's visiting physician reserved spaces on the east side, which had been in use every day for the last 8 months. which she'd walked past twice a week without registering them as anything except parking. She went back to the phone. "Colonel, the storage unit, Unit 114, who has physical access?" "Not legal access." "Physical. Is there a property management office? A secondary key holder?" The colonel was quiet for a moment. "Checking." The sound of typing. "The unit is leased under a corporate account, Desca Holdings LLC. The property management office for the Ferris Industrial Complex is..." Another pause. "Megan, the property management office for that complex is operated by a company called Strandfield Property Services. And Strandfield Property Services was acquired 18 months ago by Hargrove Meridian Group." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, opened them. "So the storage unit Mercer rented to protect himself is in a facility managed by the same organization he was working for?" "Yes." "He doesn't know that." "Almost certainly not. LLCs, shell acquisitions, the ownership chain isn't obvious." The colonel's voice had gone flat in a way that suggested she was managing her own reaction to this information. "But someone at Hargrove Meridian knows. And if they've known about the drive this whole time, they've been letting him keep it there because it was insurance," Megan said. "If Mercer ever threatened to expose the program, they could use the drive against him. If he cooperated, they left it alone." She thought about the legal motion, filed 11 minutes after she told Rourke about the drive. "But now that we know it exists, they can't let us get to it first." She turned back toward the corridor. "How long until your people are at the unit?" 22 minutes. "Tell them to go faster." She was already moving down the corridor toward the elevator bank when Rourke came around the corner from the stairwell. He'd taken the stairs up, faster, and the kind of choice that said he'd been moving with purpose. "Deeks found a transmitter," she said. "I know, I heard it on the comms." He fell into step beside her. "The receiver trace. Deeks is thinking parking lot east side. I've got 2 people checking every vehicle in that lot right now." "The storage unit? I know about Strandfield. Soren just told me." His jaw was tight. "We're going to get there in time." "You sound like you're convincing yourself." He glanced at her sideways. "A little bit." The elevator opened. They got in. As the doors closed, he said, "Mercer's counsel has been in contact with the hospital's legal team. They're coordinating. The joint position is that the search of the medication room exceeded the scope of the federal hold because it was conducted without a site-specific warrant. But the federal security hold authorizes..." "I know what it authorizes. Their argument is narrow and probably wrong, but it's going to generate paperwork, and paperwork generates delay." He looked straight ahead at the elevator doors. "Mercer's people are trying to create as many procedural obstacles as possible in the next 2 hours. Because in 2 hours, the storage unit question gets resolved one way or the other." "Yes." She thought about that. About 2 hours and the transmitter in the medication cabinet and the receiver in a parking lot and a legal motion filed in 11 minutes and a property management company that was a subsidiary of the organization at the center of all of it. About the architecture of it. How many layers? How carefully arranged? How long it had been running before today. "Mercer thinks he's the one playing defense right now," she said. Rourke looked at her. "He filed the motion to protect the drive. He thinks the drive is his exit. If the program falls apart, he produces it himself, claims he kept it as evidence of coercion, tries to position himself as a reluctant participant who documented everything against the day he could bring it forward." She watched the floor numbers descend. "He doesn't know the storage facility is Hargrove Meridian property. He doesn't know they've had access to that drive the whole time. Which means, if their people get there first and the drive disappears, he loses his exit, and he doesn't know why." She looked at Rourke. "He's going to need a new story, very fast." The elevator opened on the second floor. Through the glass doors of the hospital's administrative conference room, she could see the cluster of people who had been gathering there since the security hold began. Hospital executives, the legal team, 2 people in suits who had the specific look of insurance representatives, and at the head of the table, the hospital's CEO, a man named Gerald Pastore, who had the broad, carefully maintained face of someone accustomed to managing institutional crises with a particular combination of authority and deflection. He was talking. People were listening. Nobody at that table looked comfortable. Marcus Vell was not in the conference room. He was in the hallway outside it, leaning against the wall with his jacket over his arm and his phone to his ear, and when he saw Megan come off the elevator, he ended the call and straightened. "You look terrible," he said. 6 hours in a containment situation. "I've seen you look better after 48. He glanced at Rourke. "Commander, Marcus Vell, I'm here on behalf of Nurse Brooks." "I know who you are," Rourke said. "We spoke by phone 40 minutes ago." "Then you know I've been requesting access since before most of your people were through the door." "And you have it now. Mr. Vell, I need 5 minutes with your client before you conduct any formal consultation." Marcus looked at Megan. She nodded slightly. He stepped back. Rourke moved them both to a quieter section of hallway, away from the conference room's glass wall. He kept his voice level. "The legal situation is going to get complicated in the next 2 hours," he said. "The hospital's team is building a narrative that this entire incident was precipitated by your unauthorized re-entry into OR3 after a formal suspension. They're going to argue that everything that followed, your identification of the compound, your interaction with our team, the information you provided about the storage unit, all of it is compromised because you should not have been in that room." Megan looked at him. "I told the operator outside OR3 to secure the medication tray. He didn't. I went back in to do it myself." "I know." "The tray was the evidence. If I hadn't gone back, I know Megan." He said her name for the first time. It landed differently than she expected. "I'm not questioning what you did. I'm telling you what they're going to argue so you can be prepared." He paused. "Your documentation, the photos you took of the medication tray before the procedure, the timestamps. Stored in 3 places: cloud, email, and a copy I sent to Marcus Vell when this started." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, but the specific adjustment of a person whose contingency plan just became more viable. "Those photos predate your suspension by approximately 4 hours. "Yes." "And they show the lot number discrepancy you flagged to Mercer before the surgery." "Yes." "Which means you identified the problem, were overruled, were suspended, and then re-entered the room not to interfere with the procedure, but to prevent the evidence from being removed." He held her gaze. "That's the sequence." "That's the sequence." He nodded once. Then his radio crackled. He listened, and she watched his face, and she had gotten good enough at reading him in the last 6 hours to know when something had gone in the direction he wanted. "They found the receiver," he said, "in a vehicle in the east parking lot. Visiting physician space registered to a Dr. Carl Hess. Hess has hospital privileges, works 2 days a week in the outpatient clinic. He was not in the building today." He paused. "The vehicle was remotely accessed. Someone had a secondary key. The receiver device inside had an active wireless connection to an off-site server. Our tech team is tracing the server now." "Hargrove Meridian." "Almost certainly." He started moving toward the stairwell. "Stay with your lawyer. I'll be back in 20 minutes. He was gone before she could respond. She turned back to Marcus, who had waited with the particular patience of someone who had learned over years that hovering was counterproductive. "Walk me through everything," he said. "From this morning. All of it." She walked him through it. He didn't interrupt. He made 2 notes on his phone, brief ones, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was mapping something. "The photos are good," he said. "Timestamp integrity is going to be the first thing they challenge, but you stored them to cloud backup automatically, which creates a server-side timestamp that's harder to contest than a file timestamp." He looked at the conference room. "The suspension documentation. Did you sign anything?" "No." "Verbal acknowledgement?" "I was told by the charge nurse that administration wanted to see me. I said I knew. That's it." "Okay." He thought for a moment. "The hospital's legal team is going to come after you in 2 directions. First, the unauthorized re-entry. We address that with the evidence preservation argument, which is strong given the circumstances. Second, and this is the one that's going to sting more, they're going to question the basis of your compound identification. They're going to say you made a diagnosis outside your scope of practice, that you directed treatment without physician authorization, and that any outcome— Dr. Yates authorized the treatment change," Megan said. "She made the clinical decision. I provided information. You'll need her to say that clearly and on record." "She will." She was fairly sure of that. Yates had a particular quality of professional honesty that Megan had recognized early. She didn't protect the hierarchy when the hierarchy was wrong. It was why Mercer had never fully trusted her. I'll request a formal statement from her in the next hour. Marcus pocketed his phone. Megan, the federal charges that are going to come from this, the investigation into the patient pipeline, the pharmaceutical conspiracy, none of that touches you adversely. You're a witness and a key identifier. The hospital's action against you is a separate track, and it's a track I can fight. He paused. But I want to be honest with you. It's going to be unpleasant for a while. Even when you're vindicated, and you will be, the process of getting there is going to involve a lot of people trying to make you look smaller than you are. She looked at him. Marcus, I spent 6 years in places where people actively wanted me to be permanently smaller. I can handle unpleasant. He almost smiled. I know. I'm saying it anyway because it's my job. Her phone buzzed. Colonel Nast. She answered. Our people are at the storage unit, the colonel said. Unit 114, Ferris Industrial Boulevard. A pause that was 2 beats too long. It's been cleared. Megan's grip tightened on the phone. Cleared. The unit is empty. No drive, no equipment, no personal property. The property management office says the unit was vacated this morning at 7:40 a.m. under a standard lease termination notice. Paperwork filed digitally, processed without flags. 7:40 a.m. While Megan had been arguing with Mercer about the lot number, while the surgery had been starting. Hargrove Meridian pulled the drive before we even mobilized, she said. Before anyone knew to look for it, yes. She thought about the transmitter in the medication cabinet, the burst transmission cycle. Someone at Hargrove Meridian had been monitoring this hospital's medication logs in real time, and when the patient's monitor showed the compound's cardiac signature at 11:31, they hadn't just sent SOCOM, they'd triggered a response of their own. They'd known what the signature meant, they'd known it would bring an investigation, and they'd vacated the unit 2 hours before the first military vehicle rolled through the hospital's entrance. They had a contingency, she said. Mercer was always expendable. It looks that way, the colonel said, and the flatness in her voice carried the particular weight of a professional confronting an operation that had been better planned than she'd credited. The digital lease termination. Who filed it? Filed from an IP address registered to Desca Holdings, Mercer's shell company. Megan stopped walking, stood very still. Someone filed the termination using Mercer's company credentials, she said. Not Mercer, someone who had access to those credentials. We're running the IP. It came from within a 7-block radius of the hospital, from within range of a wireless receiver in a parking space. She went back to the stairwell and took the stairs up to the 3rd floor because the elevator was too slow and she needed to move while she thought. Marcus kept pace without asking questions, which was one of the things she valued most about him. She hit the surgical floor door and pushed through it and went directly to Soren. The drive is gone, she said. Hargrove used Mercer's corporate credentials to file a digital lease termination at 7:40 this morning. They pulled the drive before we knew it existed. Soren looked at her for a moment. Then he said, the receiver in the parking lot. Our tech team pulled the transmission logs. What did they show? The last burst transmission from the cabinet was at 6:47 a.m. He held up the laptop so she could see the screen. The content of that transmission included the dispensation records for the surgery scheduled in OR3 this morning. So they knew by 6:47 that the surgery was proceeding on schedule. And they knew from the transmission that the substituted vials were in position. He scrolled. There's one more thing. The transmission at 6:47 was received and acknowledged, and 14 minutes later at 7:01, an outgoing signal was sent from the receiver back toward the hospital's internal Wi-Fi network. Back into the hospital, she said, to a device inside the building. He set the laptop down. We identified the device. It's a tablet registered to the hospital's administrative inventory, checked out 3 weeks ago to... He paused, and the pause was the kind that meant the name on the other end of it was going to matter. To the office of the Director of Hospital Operations, a man named Randall Fitch. Megan turned the name over. Randall Fitch. She knew the name the way she knew most hospital administrative names, peripherally, from org charts and email signatures and the occasional all-staff memo. Director of Hospital Operations, responsible for facilities, logistics, vendor contracts, and, she thought about this, security system administration. The manual override of the camera system, the access that would have enabled it beyond Mercer's chief of surgery credentials, was operations-level admin access, the kind that could override any system in the building without triggering an alert. "Where is Fitch right now?" she said. "That," Soren said carefully, "is the question. He wasn't in the building. That was established within the next 15 minutes through a combination of badge tracking, camera review, and a conversation with his assistant that started with professional denial and ended with the admission that Fitch had not come in today, had called at 6:30 a.m. to report he was working from home, and had not responded to any communication since approximately 8 a.m. Working from home at 6:30 a.m., after the last burst transmission at 6:47, after the acknowledgement and the outgoing signal, after he'd known the surgery was proceeding. Rourke was back on the surgical floor by the time this picture had assembled itself, and Megan walked him through it standing at the nursing station with Soren's laptop between them and Marcus standing 3 feet away taking notes on his phone. Rourke listened without interrupting, a quality she'd come to recognize as one of his better ones, and when she finished, he was quiet for long enough that the silence had texture. "Fitch has operations-level admin access," he said, "which covers the security camera system, the vendor contract database, the facilities management network, and," she looked at Soren, "building access logs for every keycard in the hospital." "Meaning Fitch could have accessed the keycard logs before we pulled them," Soren said. "He could have seen exactly which entries were on record and known what we'd find." "And known that Mercer's entries would be there," Megan said, "and let them be, because by the time we found them, Mercer would be the story, and Fitch would be working from home." Rourke looked at the laptop, at the transmission log with its timestamps and its 7:01 a.m. outgoing signal. "He managed the transmitter installation. He manages every vendor contract for facilities maintenance in this building," Megan said. "A technician comes in to service the medication cabinet and installs a false back panel. Paperwork says routine maintenance. Nobody looks twice." "We need to find him," Rourke said. "Yes. He was already on his radio." She let him work and turned to Marcus. "The hospital's legal action against me," she said quietly. "The administrator who initiated the suspension process, who authorized it?" Marcus looked at his phone. "The order came from the director of hospital operations, delegated down to the charge nurse." Of course it had. "Randall Fitch suspended me," she said. "Within the first 20 minutes of the incident, yes." She thought about the timing. The surgery had started at 8:09. Mercer had ordered security to escort her out at 11:47. The suspension authorization, she thought about how long that paperwork took, how many approvals it required, who normally had to sign off, and in what order. A standard suspension at Ironcrest required the charge nurse's written account, the relevant department head's review, and the director of operations authorization. Greg had said administration wanted to see her within minutes of her walking out of the OR. "How quickly was the authorization granted?" she said. Marcus scrolled. "The timestamp on the authorization is 11:52. 11 minutes after the flatline. 5 minutes after she'd been walked out. The paperwork had been processed in 5 minutes, when normal processing took between 30 minutes and several hours." "It was pre-authorized," she said. Marcus looked up from his phone. Fitch had the suspension paperwork ready. He was waiting for a triggering event, something he could point to as cause. When Mercer called for security and the patient crashed, Fitch processed it immediately. She looked at the nursing station, at the camera above the elevator bank, at the building around her, which she was now seeing with a different kind of understanding, not just as a place where bad things had happened, but as a place that had been deliberately shaped to allow bad things to happen, layer by layer, access point by access point, over 14 months. He was coordinating Mercer, monitoring the medication cabinet, managing the camera system, and had a suspension order ready to go in case something went wrong. "In case someone noticed," Marcus said. "In case I noticed." She said it without ego, as a fact. "The job interview. Holt was there to see me. And after that interview, she told Fitch I was the risk. And Fitch built a mechanism to remove me cleanly if I ever got close to something. The corridor was very quiet. Down at the far end, through the break room window, she could see Petra and the other staff still clustered, still waiting. Somewhere below, the legal team was still in the conference room. Somewhere in the building, Mercer was with his operators and his lawyer, and his story about coercion that was about to become substantially more complicated. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. A voice she'd never heard. Male, older, with the particular controlled quality of someone who had prepared what they were going to say. Nurse Brooks. My name isn't important right now. What's important is that I know where Randall Fitch is, and I know what he has with him, and I'm prepared to tell you both things in exchange for an arrangement. She looked at Rourke across the station. He had heard it. He was already signaling to his operator to start a trace. Who are you? She said. Someone who made a significant mistake in judgment approximately 11 months ago when I agreed to consult for Hargrove Meridian on their patient intake program. A pause. I didn't know what it was. When I found out, I started keeping my own documentation. Where is Fitch? The arrangement first. I can't make arrangements. I'm a nurse. But you're standing next to someone who can. Another pause. Fitch has the drive, Mercer's drive. Hargrove pulled it from the unit this morning and gave it to Fitch as leverage, because Fitch has been their primary asset in this hospital from the beginning, and the drive has records that go back far enough to implicate people above Hargrove's operational level, people who are currently not in anyone's sightline. The trace. Rourke held up 3 fingers. 3 minutes. Tell me where he is, she said, and I'll make sure the commander standing next to me hears everything you have to say. A long pause. The kind that contained a decision being made in real time. Fitch is at a property registered to Desca Holdings in the Belcroft area. 4490 Harlan Road. It's a secondary facility. Hargrove used it as a staging location for the pharmaceutical compounds. The voice steadied. He's not alone. There are 2 other individuals there, and at least one of them is armed. The operator behind Rourke touched his earpiece, held up 2 fingers. 2 minutes on the trace. Stay on the line, Megan said. I'd rather not. Please. Another pause. The drive has files going back 3 years, before Ironcrest. There are 2 other hospitals, different cities. The program didn't start here. His voice had changed, lower, the performance of control giving way to something more unsteady beneath it. There are names on that drive that I recognized, people I worked with, people I thought were building something legitimate. He stopped. I need you to understand I didn't know, not at the beginning. Rourke had stepped away, radio up, already issuing coordinates. The operator was moving. The surgical floor was shifting again into the operational tempo that Megan had learned to read as a body learns a language. Not consciously, but below that, in the place where years of high-pressure experience had rewritten her baseline. She kept her voice even. The 2 other hospitals, are there patients? The line was quiet for 4 seconds. There were, the man said. She closed her eyes for the second time that day, opened them. Stay on the line, she said again. Tell me everything you know. Down the corridor, the OR doors opened and Fiona Yates came out. She was still in her scrubs, hair still pulled back, the specific exhaustion of a physician who had spent hours managing a crisis and had come out the other side with more questions than she'd gone in with. She saw Megan at the nursing station and walked toward her with a directness that said she'd been waiting for an opportunity. She stopped 3 feet away. I want to make a formal statement, she said. About this morning. All of it. What I observed, what I administered, who directed what and when. Her voice was steady. I want it on record that the treatment decision was mine, and I want it on record that the identification of the compound came from you, and that without it, I would have continued the wrong reversal protocol until... She stopped. Until it was too late. Megan looked at her, at the directness in her face, the professional pride underneath it that made this admission a hard one, and the honesty underneath that which was making her do it anyway. Marcus, Megan said without looking away from Yates, can you take Dr. Yates's statement? Right now, Marcus said. Yates followed him down the corridor. Megan turned back to the phone, where the unknown voice was still on the line, and to the operator beside Rourke, who was holding up one finger. 1 minute. And to the building around her, which was finally, slowly, beginning to give up the shape of what had been built inside it. And then Soren, at the laptop, said, "Megan," in a voice that made her look at him immediately. He turned the screen toward her. It showed a live feed from a traffic camera on the service road south of the hospital, a still frame, time-stamped from 46 minutes ago, showing the rear quarter of a silver sedan parked briefly on the shoulder, and standing beside it, passing something through the driver's window, was a figure in a hospital operations uniform with a facility badge visible on his lanyard. "Fitch met her," Soren said, before she left the vehicle at the terminal. He zoomed the image. She gave him something, or he gave her something. The angle doesn't show us which. Megan looked at the frozen image, at the silver sedan, at the man in the operations uniform, at the something passing between them that the camera couldn't resolve. She thought about a drive full of 3 years of records, 2 other hospitals, names that went above Hargrove's operational level, people who were currently not in anyone's sightline. She thought about Vivian Holt in a moving vehicle, 22 minutes ahead, making a trade. And she thought about the fact that Holt had called the nursing station, not Rourke's radio, not the federal line, and had asked specifically for the nurse, had told her specifically about the storage unit, had given her the one piece of information that sent everyone looking at Ferris Industrial Boulevard while the traffic camera on the service road recorded a meeting that nobody had been watching for. "She didn't run," Megan said quietly. Soren looked at her. "Holt didn't run. She made sure we'd be looking the wrong direction long enough for Fitch to get the drive out of the storage unit and to wherever he is now." She looked at the frozen frame. The call wasn't a trade, it was a distraction. The unnamed voice on her phone said very quietly, "She's smarter than any of you have given her credit for." And somewhere in the building below them, in the administrative conference room with its long table and its legal team and its insurance representatives, the hospital's CEO suddenly appeared in the doorway of the conference room and looked up toward the surgical floor with the expression of a man who had just been told something that had made his carefully managed crisis look like a minor prelude, and raised his hand and called for someone to find Commander Rourke immediately. Rourke was back on the surgical floor in 4 minutes. Megan had kept the unnamed voice on the phone during all of it. The man who wouldn't give his name but kept talking, slowly, in the careful way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally found a surface to set it down on. His name, he eventually said, was Dorian Marsh. He'd been a pharmaceutical logistics consultant. He'd been hired by Hargrove Meridian 11 months ago to optimize their supply chain documentation. And 3 months into the work, he'd understood enough of what he was looking at to know he should have asked different questions before signing the contract. He hadn't run. He'd stayed and documented instead, the way certain people do when they've made a mistake, and the only way they know how to live with it is to try to build something that might eventually fix it. He had 46 files. He gave Megan the cloud address while Rourke stood beside her and Soren pulled it up on the laptop. And the 3 of them looked at 46 files that covered 3 years, 3 hospitals, 9 confirmed deaths that had been recorded as natural or procedural complications, and a payment network that ran through 4 shell companies before reaching accounts connected to individuals whose names Soren read quietly and then stopped reading out loud. "I need this room cleared," Rourke said. His voice had gone very still. Megan looked at the names over Soren's shoulder. 2 of them she didn't recognize. 1 of them she did. Not personally, but the way you recognize names that appear in news coverage of federal oversight committees. The kind of name that explained why protected assets were being moved through a forged intake pathway rather than an overt one. The kind of name that explained the architecture, all the layers, all the planning, all the years. "Marsh," she said into the phone, "where are you right now?" "A parking garage on Delworth Avenue. I've been here for 3 hours. A pause. "I didn't know where else to go." She gave the address to Rourke. He relayed it without comment. Then he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was recalibrating the scope of what he'd walked into this morning. "Go be with your lawyer," he said. "I need to make calls that you shouldn't be in the room for." She understood what that meant. She took the phone, ended the call with Marsh, after confirming that Rourke's people would reach him within 20 minutes, and walked down the corridor to where Marcus was finishing Yates's formal statement on his own recording app. Yates looked up when she approached. Her statement was done. She'd said what needed saying, clearly and on record, and now she just looked like a physician at the end of a very long morning. "The patient," Megan said. "How is he?" "Stable. The recovery suite on 4. The SOCOM medical team has him. His cardiac rhythm has been clean for 2 hours." Yates paused. "He's going to have a difficult few days. The compound did some work on him before we reversed it, but he'll live." She said it the way good physicians say things like that. Not triumphant, just factual, with the quiet weight of knowing how close the other outcome had been. "Good," Megan said. "Just that." Yates stood up. She was a few inches taller than Megan, and she looked down at her with something that wasn't quite an apology, but was in the neighborhood of one. "I should have backed you up when you tried to log the discrepancy, before the surgery. You didn't know." "No, but I didn't push back either, and that's different." She picked up her jacket from the chair. "For what it's worth, I've logged it in my own incident report. My failure to support your initial flag is in there." Megan looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Yates held her gaze. "That's why I did it." She left. Megan sat down in the chair she'd vacated and looked at the wall for a moment and let herself be tired for about 45 seconds, which was approximately as long as she was willing to allocate to it. Then she stood back up because the day wasn't finished. But the Belcroft property at 4490 Harlan Road was a converted warehouse that had been operating as a pharmaceutical cold storage facility under a lease held by a subsidiary of Hargrove Meridian. Rourke's team reached it at 3:14 p.m. They went in fast and clean, and what they found inside was Randall Fitch, 2 Hargrove security contractors, one of whom was armed, and a laptop bag containing a portable hard drive that matched the serial number profile of the equipment Mercer had reportedly used for his secondary documentation. The drive was intact. Hargrove's people had not had time to wipe it. Megan learned this from Marcus, who learned it from a SOCOM legal liaison, who delivered the information with the clipped efficiency of someone conveying good news in a professional context where good news was not supposed to be celebrated too visibly. She was sitting in the hospital's second-floor family waiting room, not the conference room where the lawyers were, not the surgical floor, somewhere in between, drinking bad coffee from a vending machine and watching the parking lot through the window when Marcus sat down beside her and told her. She nodded, drank her coffee. "That's it," Marcus said. "That's the whole thing." "I know." "Fitch is in custody. The 2 contractors are in custody. The drive is secured." He paused. Dorian Marsh turned himself in to Rourke's people at the parking garage. "He's cooperating fully." She looked at the parking lot. One of the armored vehicles was still there. The local police vehicles had multiplied. 4 now instead of 2, staged at the perimeter with the resigned patience of agencies that had finally been briefed on enough to understand why they'd been asked to hold and had decided that holding was, in fact, the right call. "Vivian Holt," she said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Apprehended at Kellner Regional Airfield. The charter flight she'd arranged was delayed 40 minutes for a maintenance check, apparently a legitimate one. A hydraulic issue on the port landing gear. By the time it cleared, Rourke's people were on the tarmac." He paused. "She didn't run. When they approached the aircraft, she walked down the air stairs herself and put her hands up." Megan thought about that. About a woman who had spent years building a mechanism to deliver consequences to people who had evaded them, and who had now walked down a set of air stairs with her hands raised. She didn't know what to do with Vivian Holt, morally. That was complicated in a way that wasn't going to resolve today, or probably this year. What she knew was that Holt had made choices, and the choices had killed people, and the rationalizations she'd built around those choices were ones that the legal system was now going to have to spend a great deal of time examining. And Mercer, she said, formally arrested at 2:47 p.m. The coercion claim lasted approximately 30 minutes after his legal team was shown the access logs, the transmission data, and the financial records from the drive. Marcus set his phone on the table between them. 7 years of payments, routed through 2 accounts, one domestic, one offshore. Total received. The investigators aren't giving me a final number, but the preliminary figure is significant. He did it for money, she said. Not a question. He did it for money, and because the program gave him authority over outcomes that he found, Marcus chose his word carefully. Satisfying. The investigators found correspondence on the drive. He wrote things down, which is the kind of thing that happens when someone spends 7 years being the most important person in any room and eventually needs an audience even when no audience is safe. She thought about Mercer in the OR, about the precision of how he'd turned and pointed, the speed and the steadiness of it. She'd thought at the time that he was reaching for the nearest available explanation. She understood now that he'd been reaching for a tool he'd used before, a person to absorb consequence, a direction to redirect attention. He'd done it to others before her. He'd gotten very good at it. She put her coffee cup down on the table. It was empty. "What happens to me now?" she said. Marcus picked up his phone. The hospital's legal team withdrew the suspension documentation at 3:08 p.m., formally vacated, not paused, not under review. Vacated. He looked at her. The CEO issued a written statement 20 minutes ago acknowledging that the original action was taken without adequate review of the evidence and expressing the hospital's, and I'm quoting, profound regret for the circumstances that led to Nurse Brooks being removed from the surgical environment at a critical moment. Profound regret, she said. It's a legal document. They profoundly regret many things when the alternative is a civil suit. Am I filing a civil suit? He looked at her steadily. That's entirely up to you. You have grounds. The suspension was retaliatory, Sats. We can demonstrate that Fitch authorized it in anticipation of exactly the action you took, which means it wasn't responsive to your conduct. It was preemptive suppression. That's a different category of wrong. He paused. I'd advise you to let the federal investigation complete before you decide. Depending on what the drive produces and how the criminal proceedings go, there may be a restitution mechanism that makes more sense than civil litigation. She nodded. She'd think about it later. There was a lot she was going to think about later, stacked in a queue that was getting longer by the hour, and the discipline of not trying to process all of it simultaneously was one she'd learned in environments considerably louder and more immediately dangerous than this hospital corridor. She stood up. I want to go back to the surgical floor. You're reinstated as of the CEO's statement. You can go anywhere in this building. She went. The surgical floor was quieter than it had been. The break room had been released. Staff were moving again, filtering back to their stations with the slightly dazed quality of people re-entering routine after something that had interrupted it profoundly. Greg was at the nursing station with his tablet, doing the documentation that would cover a day that no incident report template had been designed for. He looked up when Megan came through the doors and then looked back down at his tablet. I heard the suspension was vacated, he said. It was. Good. He kept looking at the tablet. For what it's worth, the documentation I was going to file, I hadn't submitted it yet. I was waiting for the review. A pause. I told myself that was procedure. It was also... He stopped. I wasn't sure. She stood at the station for a moment. Greg was not a bad man. He was a man who had a job with edges he'd learned not to look over. And on a morning when looking over the edge was what the situation required, he'd stood back from it. She didn't respect that, but she understood it in the way she understood a great many things about institutional behavior that she'd spent years bumping up against and had never managed to stop being disappointed by. Submit the documentation, she said. All of it. Complete and accurate. It's going to be reviewed by federal investigators, and it needs to be clean. I know. And Aldous. She waited until he looked up. The nurses on this floor who were pressured into silence over the last year, Mercer documented that. His correspondence on the drive references at least 4 nurses by name who flagged discrepancies and were told to let it go. They're going to need support through what comes next. He held her gaze. I'll make sure of it. She believed him. Not entirely. She had a complicated relationship with entirely, but enough. She walked past the OR doors, past the scrub sinks, past the medication room where Deeks had finished his work, and the cabinet now bore an evidence seal and a federal lock that would stay in place until the court process completed. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor, the same window she'd looked through twice today, at the armored vehicles in the morning and at the diminished perimeter in the afternoon. And she stood there for a while and let the day exist in its full shape without trying to reduce it to something more manageable. 6 lives. The drive confirmed it. 6 people who had died in 3 hospitals over 3 years, in procedures that had been documented as complications, that had generated investigations that had found nothing because the people running the investigations had been looking at medical error in buildings that had been carefully arranged to produce it and then hide it. 6 people under federal protection for various reasons, some of them reasons she might not have approved of if she'd known them, which was a thought she turned over carefully and set aside, because the mechanism that had killed them was the same regardless of who they were. You didn't get to be the consequence. That was not a power any individual was equipped to hold without losing something essential. She thought about Vivian Holt walking down the air stairs with her hands up. She thought about the particular expression of a person who has done what they intended and is now prepared to stand in the space that creates. She didn't know if that was courage or certainty or something else entirely. She wasn't sure the distinction mattered at this point. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. Different from the one Marsh had called from. Different from SOCOM's administrative exchange. She answered. Nurse Brooks. A man's voice. Older. Carefully modulated. This is Undersecretary Pelham, Office of the Inspector General. I've been briefed on today's events. I wanted to call you directly. She said nothing, waiting. The patient you treated this morning is a federal witness whose protection was being actively compromised at the time of his admission. Without your intervention, he would not have survived the procedure. A pause. I want you to hear that clearly from this office. I hear it, she said. There will be a formal recognition process. I don't want to front-run it with details that aren't finalized, but I want you to know it's coming, and I want you to know it comes with the full weight of this office behind it. Another pause, shorter. The nurses who were silenced on that floor, there will be a process for them as well. Full review, formal clearing of any adverse documentation. Petra Kwan, she said. She works nights. She went on record 6 months ago that I was the most careful nurse on the floor. Her nurse manager filed a counter-notation calling her assessment compromised by personal preference. I'll make sure that notation is specifically addressed. And the 4 nurses Mercer named in his correspondence. All of them. She exhaled once, slowly. Thank you, Undersecretary. The call ended. She pocketed her phone and stayed at the window for another minute, watching the parking lot where the last armored vehicle was preparing to move out, its job on this location complete, transitioning to whatever came next in a process that would run for months through courts and hearings and testimony and all the grinding institutional machinery that turns events into consequences. She heard footsteps. Rourke. She knew his footfall by now. Measured, deliberate, the walk of someone who moved through spaces with purpose, even when the purpose was just to stand beside someone at a window. He stopped next to her. They stood there together for a moment without talking. The patient's name, she said. Can you tell me now? His name is Warren Stills. He was a mid-level accountant for a defense contractor. He found something in the books 2 years ago and reported it, and the reporting led to a federal case that's been under seal, and the case involves people who had the resources and the connections to arrange what happened here. He paused. He's not a hero. He's just a man who saw something wrong and said so, and that made him a target. She thought about that. About a mid-level accountant who'd seen something in the books, about how ordinary that was as an origin point for something this large and this ugly, about how often the people who ended up in the middle of things like this were not the people who had sought the middle of things like this. He's going to be okay, she said. Medically, yes. Everything else, Rourke looked at the parking lot. He's going to be in protection for a while. Tell him, if it's appropriate to tell him anything, tell him his heart rate held. At the end, when it was stabilizing, it held. Rourke looked at her. A small thing moved across his face that she wouldn't quite call a smile but was adjacent to one. I'll tell him. He left. She stayed at the window a few minutes longer. The formal recognition came 6 weeks later, not at the hospital. The hospital held its own event, smaller, with new leadership, a new board, and the kind of institutional sincerity that comes when an organization has been sufficiently scared into genuine change. But in a conference room at a federal building downtown, with Undersecretary Pelham and Colonel Nast and Rourke, and two other officials whose titles were long and whose expressions were the careful neutral of people who dealt in serious things and treated them seriously. Megan sat in a chair across a table from them and received the formal commendation with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, present, clear-eyed, not performing either humility or indifference. Pelham read the language of the commendation, which was detailed and specific in the way official language sometimes manages to be when the events are clear enough that vagueness would be an insult. It named the compound. It named the reversal protocol. It named the 7-part access network she'd helped unravel in a single operational day. It named Warren Stills, with his permission, and noted that he was alive. When it was done, she accepted the document and the handshakes and the particular solemnity of the room, and then she said, "The nurses, Petra Kwan, and the others." "Completed," Colonel Nast said. "All adverse notations cleared. Formal letters issued to each. The nurse manager who filed the counter notation against Kwan has resigned." Megan nodded. "Is there anything else you need from this office?" Pelham said. She thought about it. Actually thought about it, the way you do when someone asks a real question and you decide to give it a real answer. "Make the intake pathway harder to forge," she said. "Whatever structural gap Hargrove exploited, close it. So the next facility that receives a protected patient actually knows it's receiving a protected patient, and the monitoring is built in from the start." She paused. "And the lot number verification process for surgical medications needs a second check that doesn't rely on the surgical team catching it themselves. Something structural, not dependent on whoever happens to be in the room that morning." Pelham wrote something down. He looked like a man who was going to actually do something with what he'd written, which was a look she'd learned to identify as distinct from the look of someone performing the act of writing. "We'll be in touch," he said. She left the federal building and stood on the sidewalk outside in the October light, which was the particular thin gold of early autumn, and she had the specific feeling of a person who has come out the other side of something large and is not yet sure what the other side looks like, but is standing in it regardless. Marcus Vell was waiting on the sidewalk. He'd driven her. He was reading something on his phone, and he looked up when the door opened and he said, without preamble, "How was it?" "Official," she said, "but real. That's the best you can hope for with federal recognition." He pocketed his phone. "What now?" She looked down the street. At the city, moving around her in its ordinary Tuesday way, people and vehicles and the sounds of a place that didn't know and didn't need to know what had happened 6 weeks ago in a surgical suite in a hospital 2 miles northeast. The world didn't pause for the things that happened inside it. It just kept moving, and you either moved with it or you stood still and let it go past, and she had never been particularly good at standing still. "I have a shift at Ironcrest tomorrow," she said. 7 a.m. Marcus looked at her. "You're going back." "The floor is short-staffed. It's been short-staffed for months because staff didn't feel safe raising concerns, and 2 of the strongest nurses on the surgical floor were documenting themselves out of a job." She started walking toward his car. "They need people who will actually do the work." "You could go somewhere else. Given what you've done, any hospital in this region would—" "I know." She reached the car, stopped, looked back at him. "Mercer made that floor into something it shouldn't have been. Fitch made this building into a place where people were afraid to write things down. I spent 8 months in that hospital before I knew any of that, and I don't think going somewhere else and starting over is the same thing as doing something about it." She paused. "And the nurses who are still there, they saw what happened when someone didn't let it go. I want them to see what comes after that." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he unlocked the car. "You're going to make a very uncomfortable colleague for whoever tries to cut corners in that medication room." "That's the idea," she said, and got in. 3 months after the events at Ironcrest Regional Hospital, Dr. Adrian Mercer was convicted on 8 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, and pharmaceutical fraud. He was sentenced to 22 years. His medical license was permanently revoked. At sentencing, he told the court he had been acting under coercion. The judge noted that 7 years of documented compensation and personal correspondence indicated otherwise, and moved on. Randall Fitch pleaded guilty to 7 counts and received 18 years. The 2 Hargrove security contractors received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony that extended the investigation upward into the names on the drive that Soren had stopped reading aloud. That process took considerably longer and was, at the time this story ends, still ongoing. Vivian Holt was convicted on 6 counts of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life. She did not appeal. At her sentencing hearing, she read a prepared statement. Not a justification, not a request for sympathy, just a list of the 6 people who had died and what she believed they had done. The judge told her that the court was not the appropriate venue for her beliefs about the victims, and she said, "I know," and sat down, and that was the last public statement she made. Dorian Marsh received a reduced sentence of 4 years suspended, with 2 years of supervised release in exchange for his 46 files and his full cooperation. He was barred from consulting in pharmaceutical logistics for 10 years. He sent Megan a brief letter 6 weeks after the sentencing, which said only, "I know an apology isn't the right word. I don't have the right word. I'm sorry anyway." She kept the letter. She wasn't sure why. Some things you keep not because they resolve something, but because they are honest. And honesty in its plain form is rarer than it should be. The shift started at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday in November, and the surgical floor was different now in the ways that mattered and stubbornly the same in the ways that didn't. The equipment was the same. The linoleum was the same. The specific smell of the scrub room, antiseptic, and the metallic edge of recycled air was exactly the same, and she stood in it for a moment and let it be familiar. Petra Kwan was at the nursing station when Megan came on. She looked up, and her expression did something complicated and genuine, and then she said, "The secondary medication check protocol went live yesterday. New system. Every vial gets cross-referenced against a central pharmaceutical database before it enters the surgical suite." "I heard," Megan said. "How's it running?" "Slow. 2 extra minutes per tray." Petra paused. "Nobody's complaining." Megan dropped her bag in the locker room and pulled on her compression socks. The same pair, finally broken in, and she clipped her badge to her scrub top and walked back out to the floor and began. There was a patient in pre-op whose medication log had an entry she wanted to cross-reference before the procedure. She pulled the chart, checked the numbers. The numbers were correct, but she checked them anyway because that was the work. Not the dramatic moments, not the crises, not the morning when the helicopters came, but this. The consistent, unglamorous, granular attention to the things that could go wrong before they went wrong. A first-year nursing student was shadowing the floor that morning, a young man named Tobias who was several weeks into his clinical rotation and was doing the things students do when they're trying to decide whether they've made the right decision about their lives. He watched Megan work for about an hour before he asked, tentatively, how she stayed calm when things got complicated. She thought about the question, not about what answer would sound good, but about what was actually true. "You don't start with calm," she said. "You start with the next thing that needs doing. And then the thing after that. Calm is what's left over when you've got a handle on the sequence." He thought about that. "And when you don't have a handle on the sequence?" She looked at him. "Then you find the one thing you can control, and you control it, and you work outward from there." She turned back to the chart. "That's it. That's the whole method." He was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook, and she didn't ask what because that was his to keep. The floor moved around them. The day proceeded. Somewhere in the building, in a 4th-floor suite that now had proper federal monitoring and a properly verified intake protocol, Warren Stills had been discharged 2 months ago and was somewhere else entirely, alive and ordinary, which was the best possible outcome for a man whose only ambition had been to go back to being ordinary. Megan checked the medication log, documented what she found, passed the chart to the attending. Nobody pointed at her, nobody asked her to leave. She did her job with her full attention and her imperfect hands and the knowledge, carried quietly and without announcement, of exactly how much that was worth. Real strength doesn't need to introduce itself. It just shows up on time, does the work, and refuses, every single time without drama or exception, to look the other way.